I was sitting at my kitchen table, halfway through my second cup of coffee on a Thursday morning, when two detectives knocked on my door. The sound was firm, official, the kind of knock that makes your heart skip, even when you've done nothing wrong. I opened the door to find a man and a woman, both wearing expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Allison Carter?" the woman asked, though her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. "Yes, that's me," I said, my voice suddenly feeling too small. "I'm Detective Rachel Mendez. And this is Detective James Pritchard. We need to ask you some questions. May we come in?" My mind raced through every possible scenario. Had something happened to my parents? My sister? But the way they were looking at me like I was the subject rather than the recipient of bad news sent a chill down my spine. "Of course," I managed. Stepping aside to let them enter, we sat in my living room. Me on the edge of the couch, them in the chairs across from me. Detective Mendez pulled out a small notebook while Detective Pritchard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Miss Carter, can you tell us where you were on the evening of October 8th? October 8th. I tried to think back. That was nearly 3 weeks ago. I think I was here. At home. I usually am on weeknights. Can anyone verify that?" "I live alone," I said, feeling suddenly defensive. "What is this about?" The detectives exchanged a glance, one of those silent communications that only partners who've worked together for years can manage. Detective Pritchard spoke next. "There was a robbery at a jewelry store in downtown Portland on October 8th. During the investigation, we found DNA evidence at the scene." He paused, watching my reaction. "Your DNA, Miss Carter." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words didn't make sense, like he was speaking a language I'd never learned. That's impossible. I've never robbed anywhere. I've never even been to that jewelry store." "Which one was it?" "Rothstein and Sons on Morrison Street." I shook my head vigorously. "I don't even know where that is. There has to be some mistake." "DNA doesn't make mistakes," Detective Mendez said, her voice softer but no less serious. "We ran it through CODIS, the national database. It's a match to a sample we have on file from when you applied for that teaching position at Lincoln High School 2 years ago. My teaching application." I remembered the background check, the fingerprinting, the cheek swab. It had felt invasive at the time, but it was standard procedure. I never imagined it would come back to haunt me like this. "I don't understand," I whispered. "How can my DNA be there when I've never been there?" Detective Pritchard's expression remained neutral. "That's what we're trying to figure out. We're not accusing you of anything yet, Miss Carter, but you understand why we had to follow up on this." Yet, that word hung in the air like a guillotine. They asked me more questions. Did I know anyone who worked at the jewelry store? No. Had I lost any personal items recently? Not that I could remember. Did anyone have access to my home? Just my landlord. And he was a 65-year-old man who could barely manage the stairs after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. The detectives left, but not before telling me not to leave town. I closed the door behind them and immediately burst into tears. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I called my best friend Maya and through broken sobs told her everything. She came over within 20 minutes, armed with wine and the kind of fierce loyalty that makes you grateful for friendship. "This is insane," she said, pouring us both generous glasses. "You didn't do anything wrong." "They'll figure it out, but what if they didn't? What if I went to prison for a crime I didn't commit?" I'd seen enough true crime documentaries to know that the justice system wasn't infallible. Innocent people went to jail. Lives were ruined. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how my DNA could have ended up at a crime scene I'd never visited. And then, around 3 in the morning, a memory surfaced. About 6 months ago, I'd been sick. Really sick. The flu had knocked me flat, and I'd spent a week barely able to leave my bed. During that time, I'd ordered everything: online food, medicine, tissues. One delivery driver had been particularly kind. A young woman with bright red hair who'd brought my groceries right to my door and even offered to help me inside since I looked so pale. Could she have taken something? A glass I'd drunk from? A tissue from my trash? It seemed paranoid. But what other explanation was there? The next morning, I called Detective Mendez and told her about the memory. She listened patiently and said she'd look into it, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. To her, it probably sounded like a desperate person grasping at straws. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Carolyn West, who specialized in criminal defense. She was expensive, draining my savings account, but she was also the first person who seemed to truly believe me. DNA transfer is more common than people think, she explained during one of our meetings. Secondary transfer, tertiary transfer. There are all kinds of ways your DNA could end up somewhere you've never been. We just need to prove it. But proving it was harder than it sounded. The detectives had already interviewed all the delivery drivers who'd come to my apartment during my illness, and none of them had bright red hair. The company I'd ordered from had records going back months, and there was no one matching that description. I started to wonder if I'd imagined her. If my fevered brain had conjured up a helpful stranger who didn't actually exist. The doubt was corrosive, eating away at my certainty about everything. Then, one afternoon in early November, Detective Mendez called me. "We need you to come down to the station," she said, and something in her voice had changed. She sounded almost apologetic. At the station, I was led to an interview room where both detectives were waiting, along with Carolyn. Detective Pritchard looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "Miss Carter," Detective Mendez began, "we owe you an apology. We've arrested someone in connection with the jewelry store robbery." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I nearly collapsed. "Who?" "A woman named Jenna Blackwood. She's a professional thief, been on our radar for a while. When we brought her in on an unrelated charge, she had items in her possession that matched evidence from the Rothstein robbery." Mendez paused. She also had a collection of personal items in her apartment. Items taken from various people, including several objects that appear to belong to you. My stomach turned. "What kind of objects?" "A hairbrush, some used tissues, a toothbrush, a drinking glass. We're still cataloging everything, but it's clear she was collecting DNA samples from different people." "But why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Detective Pritchard spoke up. "Best we can figure, she was using other people's DNA to throw us off her trail. She'd leave samples at crime scenes, a hair here, saliva there, to confuse the investigation. Make us chase innocent people while she got away clean." The room felt like it was spinning. Someone had been collecting pieces of me, using me as a shield for their crimes. How did she get my stuff? We're still piecing that together. But we found evidence that she'd been working with several accomplices. People who helped her gather DNA samples from unsuspecting victims. One of them was a woman who worked for various delivery services under different aliases. Red hair was a wig. The delivery driver. I'd been right, but that brought no satisfaction. Only violation. Ms. Blackwood will be charged with multiple counts of robbery, identity theft, and evidence tampering. Among other things, Detective Mendez continued. "Your name has been completely cleared. We're truly sorry for what you've been through." I nodded, unable to speak. Carolyn put a hand on my shoulder. As I left the police station that day, I felt like I was walking through a dream. The nightmare was over, but its echoes would stay with me. I'd learned that your identity wasn't just your name or your face. It was your very cells, your genetic code. And someone could steal that just as easily as they could steal your wallet. But I'd also learned something else. Maya, who'd stood by me without question. Carolyn, who'd fought for me when the evidence seemed damning. Even Detective Mendez, who'd followed every lead no matter how thin. These people had believed in my innocence when the science seemed to prove my guilt. A week later, I got a call from Detective Mendez again. I tensed, conditioned now to expect bad news. "I wanted to give you an update," she said. "Jenna Blackwood's case is moving forward. Her accomplices are cooperating. And we've linked her to at least a dozen other crimes where she planted other people's DNA. You helped us crack a much bigger case than we realized." "I didn't do anything," I said. "You trusted your truth." "That's not nothing." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen, the same spot where I'd been drinking coffee that Thursday morning when everything changed. Sunlight streamed through the window, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The experience had shattered my sense of security in ways I was still processing. I'd installed new locks, changed all my passwords, become hyper-aware of who had access to my space and my things. But I'd also discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed. When faced with the unimaginable, I hadn't broken. I'd fought. I thought about all those true crime stories I'd consumed over the years, always as an observer, never imagining I'd become a character in one. But here I was, on the other side of something that had nearly destroyed my life, stronger and more aware than before. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night. That moment of panic returning, the detectives at my door, the impossible accusation. But then I remember how it ended. Not with me in handcuffs, but with the truth coming to light. The way it should. The thing about DNA is that it's supposed to be unique, individual, yours alone. But Jenna Blackwood had found a way to weaponize that uniqueness, to turn our most personal identifiers against us. She'd stolen more than just jewelry from that store. She'd stolen pieces of people's identities, their sense of safety, their trust in the world. As I write this, her trial is approaching. The prosecutor says I might be called to testify, to tell my story of those terrifying weeks when I was a suspect in a crime I didn't commit. Part of me dreads it, dreads reliving that fear. But another part of me wants to face her, to look her in the eye and reclaim what she took from me. Maya says I should write a book about it. Carolyn says there could be policy changes that come from this case, new protections against DNA theft and planting. I don't know about any of that. I just know that my ordinary life became extraordinary in the worst possible way. And then, through persistence and truth, became ordinary again. But it's a different kind of ordinary now. One where I lock my doors twice, where I never leave personal items in public, where I'm more careful about who I trust. Some might call that paranoia. I call it survival. The jewelry store has reopened. I drove past it once, just to see it, to make it real. It looks so normal, so innocent, just a storefront on a busy street. No one would know that something life-changing had happened there. That evidence left inside had nearly ruined an innocent woman's life. I think about the other victims whose DNA Jenna collected. According to the police, there were at least 30 of us. 30 people who might have been accused, investigated, their lives turned upside down. Some of them probably never even knew how close they came. I was unlucky enough to be the one whose sample she used. But I was also lucky enough that the truth came out before irreparable damage was done. That's the thing about justice, it's not always guaranteed. But when it works, when the system grinds through its process and arrives at the truth, it feels like a miracle. 3 months after that first knock on my door, I was back in my classroom, teaching American literature to teenagers who had no idea what I'd been through. I didn't tell them. It wasn't their burden to carry. But sometimes when we discuss themes of justice and truth in the books we read, I think about my own experience. How life really does imitate art in the strangest ways. One of my students asked me once why I always emphasize the importance of standing up for the truth, even when it's difficult. I wanted to tell her about the detectives, about the DNA, about the woman who'd stolen pieces of me to cover her crimes. Instead, I just smiled and said, "Because the truth matters. It always matters." She seemed satisfied with that answer. I was 2. As I stand here now, in my apartment, looking out at the Portland skyline, I think about how quickly life can change. One morning you're drinking coffee, and the next you're fighting to prove your innocence. But you keep fighting because what else can you do? You trust the truth, you lean on the people who believe in you, and you hope that justice, however imperfect, will find its way, and sometimes, just sometimes, It does. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt wrongly accused or struggled to prove your truth, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters. And if you found this story compelling, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories out there of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. And together, we can shed light on the complexities of justice, identity, and what it means to fight for yourself when the odds seem impossible. Thank you for listening to my story. It means more than you know.